local level. So by the time you do a thorough background, it makes it so easy to create that statement of the problem. A statement of the problem is the place where I ask, so what? Why should I care about what you're doing? Why should I care about adolescents living in slums? Why should I care about their complex trauma? Why should I care about their post-traumatic stress? And why should I care about their post-traumatic goals? So the gap, which is also considered as the missing piece or pieces in the literature, is the area that has not yet been explored or underexplored. So this could be population or sample size, type, location. It could be research method, data collection, and or analysis. So it's very important that you keep in mind that just because you identify a gap in research doesn't necessarily mean that your research question is worthy of exploration. Okay, so you want to make sure that your research will have the valuable practical and or theoretical implication. So in other words, answering the research questions could either improve existing practice or inform professional decision-making, or it could revise, build upon, or create theoretical frameworks informing research design and practice. Depending on what you read, some people will say, well, when you are exploring gaps in the literature, you can do the classic literature gap or the disagreement gap or the contextual gap or the methodological gap. Okay, so classic literature gap is the type of research gap that emerges when there's a new concept or phenomenon that hasn't been studied much at all. So that is your classic literature. So reading, but you're realizing, wait, nobody has really touched on this part. That's what we call classic literature gap. Then we have the disagreement gap. And this emerges when there are contrasting or contradictory findings in the existing literature regarding a specific research question. Then we have the contextual gap, which exists when there's already a decent body of research on a particular topic, but there's an absence of research in specific context. And so it's possible that, hey, there's a lot of literature on complex trauma among adults, but there seems to be very little on adolescents. So if that is yours, then you bring that out. And the methodological gap, this is the type where you'd argue that the methodology of existing studies is lacking in some way, or that they are missing a certain perspective. For example, you might argue that majority of the existing research has taken a quantitative approach, and therefore there's a lack of rich insight and texture that a qualitative study could provide. You could also argue that the existing literature primarily looked at cross-sectional studies, and because of that, provided only a snapshot view, whereas a longitudinal approach could have uncovered a lot of the constructs and how the variables have evolved over time. What I generally ask my students to do in terms of research gap is to use the Miles 2017 research classification or gap. Interesting. Every time I'm talking about this, I forget it's not terminology, there's a name for it, but let's just call it classification. Okay, so Miles identifies, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 research gaps. And I will tell students, give me between 2 to 4 of them in your statement of the problem. So it depends on what you are studying. It could be evidence gap, knowledge gap, practical gap, methodological gap, empirical gap, theoretical gap, or population gap, or a combination of those. Okay, so let's see if I can explain that to you a bit, and then later on, I'll give you examples, and then that will be the end of this part. And then we'll do other parts too later on. So evidence gap is also called, did I give, no, let's talk about it before I give you examples. So it's also called the contradictory evidence gap. So this is where results from studies allow for conclusions in their own right, And yet these conclusions are contradictory when examined from a more abstract view. So if you're reading and you realize that, wait, they are contradictory, then that becomes an evidence gap. Then we have the knowledge gap, which is also called the knowledge void gap. This occurs when desired research findings do not exist. Then the practical knowledge gap is also called the action knowledge conflict gap. This occurs when professional behavior or practices deviate from research findings or are not covered by research. The methodological gap is also called the method and research design gap. This occurs when there's a variation of research methods necessary to generate new insights, or they avoid distorted findings. And so we need to find out, wait, what methodology has been used in the previous research, and how is that helping us generate new ideas, or how are they helping us avoid distorted findings, and what is it we need to do now to make sure that we consolidate these findings. Then we have empirical gap. It's also called the evaluation void gap. This occurs when research findings or propositions need to be evaluated or empirically verified. Theoretical gap is also called theory application void gap. The theory should be applied to certain research issues to generate new insights. And so when you look at the literature, you realize there's a lack of theory, thus a gap exists in that area. Then the population gap occurs when research regarding population is not adequately represented or under-researched. And so, for example, you will have maybe the research has looked at, especially when your research is talking about clergy, you realize that majority of the times they focus on the male. So if you want to establish population gap, then you say majority of the research has used male. So I want to, there's a population gap in there, which my study intends to fill by looking at female clergy. Or it could be race or ethnicity, or in the case of this student looking at adolescents' complex trauma, it was because a lot of complex trauma studies had focused on adults and not enough on adolescents. Let's look at some examples, and then we will call it a day for this part of the work. So evidence gap or contradictory evidence gap. So when you have, and you can't just do this by looking at 3 or 4 page articles. I would give you what my professor gave me. He said, Hannah, read at least 50 articles. I would tell my students, read at least 30 articles on the same subject area or similar variables. By the time you are on your 5th one, you realize that a picture is coming up clearly for you. So if you have established an evidence gap, an example of write-up could be the researcher identified an apparent evidence gap in the prior research concerning, and then you talk about what your study was, what you discovered, and previous research has addressed several aspects of topic A, topic B, topic C. And so you cite between 2 to 3 relevant articles, and then you're building an argument. Okay, so then you are establishing what the research has shown. And then the moment you bring in the however, you are providing a contradiction. So what is it they did? However, they didn't do this. And so that is where the gap comes in that your study is going to fill. And you provide the appropriate citation, especially using Miles 2017, because it's his framework that we are using. Then if it's a knowledge gap, you say that a researcher identify an apparent. So I like the use of apparent because what may look like, oh, this is what it looks like. Maybe when you look at it with another lens, you realize it's not what it looks like. So in addition, the prior research did not address the subject of, then you describe what that is. This encompasses several unexplored dimensions that lately have attracted research attention in other disciplines. You can't make statements like that unless you have really read, okay? So whatever it is should be explored further to provide an understanding as to why such is not the case with whatever you want to explore. And that is the miles one. And so you can tweak this statement a bit to fit whatever gap you have established for your own work. So we have looked at backgrounds of the study and then dived a bit deeper into what the statement of the problem contains. In subsequent parts of this work, we're going to be looking at the purpose of the study and how we write that, objectives, research questions, and or hypothesis. That will probably be the second part. And then the third part, we will look at theoretical and or conceptual framework, how we connect the significance and provide a delimitation of the study. Before we go to the other large sections of the work, I hope you find this helpful. And feel free to share this with your friends, especially when you come together and you are talking about research and how fun and or complicated it can be. Okay.